So, welcome everyone to our Seleukid lecture. I'm Altay Coskun, professor of classical studies at the University of Waterloo, and I would also like to extend greetings of my co-host Rabbi Ben Skolnick, who unfortunately cannot be with us today because his duties as rabbi have called him off on short notice. So I don't think that I need an introduction by myself today, as I've been running this show, this series since 2022. But I'd like to say a few words about the respondent, Dr. Richard Wenghofer from Nipissing University, North Bay, Ontario. Most of you know him already, partly because he is a regular attendant of the Seleukid study days, partly he was the local host of the Seleukid ideology workshop we held at Nipissing University in 2017. And as a result of that, Richard and I also co-edited the volume on Seleukid ideology in 2023. Now, everyone knows that Richard and we are close friends. And is it an appropriate thing to ask a friend to give feedback? Am I going the easy way here? In some regards, I am. However, Richard is not just an expert in all matters Seleukids and in all matters ethnic constructs, but also we have a very special friendship. We made friends, we remained friends, we deepened our friendship through our cordial disagreements on everything. So whenever we meet, we celebrate disagreeing about things and really looking at problems from all angles. And the beautiful thing is very often after a long discussion, he and we leave these conversations having understood so much more, whether we have been converted or not. We have both benefited very much from this conversation. And the best example I can give is our long-standing disagreement about whether to choose a realist or a constructivist approach, whether to be a little bit more cynical or a little bit more positive or generous with your assumptions about goodness in human beings. And the finest result of this, this conversation we had about Seleukid ideology, was it useful at all? What did it change? Was it not all dependent on the military and perhaps financial resources on the Seleukids? Or did ideological discourse really matter and make a big difference? So that was a conversation we had for many years. And initially, I think our conversation was much more confrontational, not in an unfriendly way, but just completely rejecting the other idea. But in the course of the years, we developed, each of us, one major article on the use or uselessness, the efficacy or lack thereof of Seleukid ideology. And these two articles are now not confrontational, but very much complementary. And they close the volume on Seleukid ideology that the two of us have produced together. So I do hope that our conversation today is a start of another very productive conversation. And so Richard is, I think, the ideal colleague to be my respondent and then open the floor to our conversation. Okay, with this I start my lecture, which has the title Revisiting Seleukid Foundation Stories Within the Framework of Colonial Encounters and Ethnicity Constructs. I first intended to give a somewhat shorter version of this paper in Utrecht on 15th November in 2024 at the end of the workshop New Trends in Seleukid Studies, but unfortunately there was turmoil on the streets of many streets in the Netherlands those days. So we had to evacuate the room and I had to reschedule the lecture. So today is the first time that I'm giving it in a somewhat extended way. So this is a this is not a regular lecture on one clearly defined research topic. It's much more experimental. I'm exploring new areas for research, for actually a major research project that I would like to conduct in collaboration with many colleagues and students over the next 5 to 10 years. And it draws most of its inspiration from some of the work I've been doing in my Black Sea studies, connecting me with Greek colonization in the Archaic period. I'm also interested in classical Athens and Athenian imperialism, as well as in Roman imperialism, and obviously in the Hellenistic world and Seleucid imperialism. And when I say imperialism, in most cases, there is also a colonial side to it, settlement. But then, much more widely, there's also exploration and so on. So, what I'm trying to do is to build a research plan or to develop research questions and methodology that may help us, that may help me personally to to design a red thread through my various research areas in the ancient world, but also to come up with something new in collaboration. So I'm still at this experiential status. So at the beginning or the next 2-3 minutes, I will give some more introduction about the background of this major project idea. I will then give you 2 examples from the Archaic period, from completely unrelated to the Seleukids, before the second half or the third major chapter will then focus on Seleukid foundation legends. So I have been exploring these thoughts in a set of workshops at Waterloo, Empúries, and upcoming a conference panel in Wrocław for the 17th FIEC, and also another workshop at Waterloo. You have here the details. By the way, you have the full slideshow linked to the chat box. If you go to the chat box anytime, you can download the slideshow and have all the links and the footnotes that I will not lose much time with in this presentation. Just a few words about ethnic identity and ethnic construct. Of course, there are many components to the idea of ethnicity. And traditionally in Greek studies, Hellenic studies, there was a lot of talk about language and dialects, which define being Greek or being an Ionian, an Aeolian, and so on. Archaeologists have more focused on specific cults, but then there's also the much broader sphere of material culture where disputes are ongoing as to whether the user of a special pot or weapon is he or she defined ethnically by that material object. In other words, do pots equal people? Art historians like to concentrate on visual sources, paintings and sculpture, which of course reflect very often similar trends or even narratives, ideas that can be related to ethnic concepts. With anthropology and more specifically human biology, we have completely new means of approaching the question of identity. And add to this the many theories and ideologies of the modern world, which constantly allow or force us to rethink traditional approaches. Most of these topics or perspectives will not play a prominent role in what I'm doing, although there will be many intersections. But the main project idea that I have, and also today's presentation, will narrowly focus on narratives, more specifically on narratives of founders and foundations, often colonial settlements, but not just that, because the whole sphere of exploration of new territories, new people, of course, intersect very strongly. And we have to do with legends, with epics, but also with historiography, all different genres of narratives on the one hand, but all also overlapping in many regards. When I want to approach narratives of Greek foundation legends, I will not lose many words about the extremes, the extreme poles, naive acceptance of fictional texts is something that was done in many, as we see throughout the pre-modern world and in part still in the modern world. That's not what I intend, but neither do I intend a hypocritical rejection based on the fact that there are many fictional elements as soon as we have to do with gods, heroes, monsters. We know there is fiction, but I want to honor the lived experience, but also the aspirational expressions that we find in these narratives. And then also even wild fiction may have a connection to the real world, and that's what I'd like to explore. I have chosen for the next stages three scholars that have contributed a lot to our understanding of Greek foundation legends. I start with Carol Doherty. Her seminal book from 1993, The Poetics of Colonization, From City to Text in Archaic Greece, has tried to identify four archetypes, for archetypical interactions that we can identify in many, not all, but in many foundational stories. Purification, or often in combination with murder, is one. Linguistic appropriation of new land by solving riddled oracles, another. I'm particularly intrigued by the third item, physical appropriation or even fertilizing foreign land through marriage of a male Greek founder with a local woman, often a princess. I dropped the keyword Pocahontas. So it's actually a very long-lasting motif going through the millennia, and we see it in varied versions popping up throughout the ages. Then also victory in an athletic contest. So these are very good categories, useful categories, and our research will draw on these. But one observation is they seem to be all exclusively from the Greek perspective. These are Greek themes, Greek patterns, and when they are applied, they speak to a Greek audience and just focus on the Greek side. And that's why I'm also intrigued by Marta Oyer-Guzman's approach, which tries to bring in the non-Greek side in a very meaningful way. But she also includes depth psychology in somewhat different ways, as Doherty has done. She has identified in many foundation narratives 4 stages. First, the beginning with friendly cooperation. I find that very important, and I have to admit that I had not taken this into account sufficiently, but if you look into so many stories, you see the beginning is often very friendly, and it's reasonable also when we think of the real world. Many colonial settlers or explorers came as a minority. They were dependent on the goodwill and even on the protection of the locals. But then we see in a second phase often some destabilization of pre-existing networks. We see in many narratives expressions of fear, and very often then there is violence escalating. And most of the stories we have result in Greek success, so these stories then often end with Greek dominance, but we should assume that in many cases colonial projects also failed. These two approaches, they are very valuable. They show us, well, they explain us a lot about the symbolism and general human experience. They are timeless, often placeless, and ethnically unspecific. But that's also quite problematic for me as a historian, because I would like to use these stories, these narratives, to for approaching very specific places and times and historical situations. So that is why I'm very much intrigued by the work of Meg Sweeney. I hope I pronounce her first name correctly. I've heard it pronounced as Nisha. And so she tried to, with her foundational book, Foundation, Myth, and Politics, she tried to overcome simplistic binaries, which we find a lot in ancient sources, but also in modern scholarly work. Binary opposites such as Europe and Asia, Greek and barbarian, male and female. And I now quote, this oppositional model did still gain ground and became especially dominant in the political rhetoric of classical Athens. The Ionians do not seem to have seen themselves as being either Greek or barbarian, either European or Asian. Instead, they seem to have constructed their past with a greater sense of fluidity and ambiguity. Foundation myths were used to play down the distinction between Greek and barbarian. Most crucially, connection is made with the land itself. And then where people had once come from was not so important. So that is an alternative approach. McSweeney acknowledges changing narratives, especially if confronted with the dominant Athenian model. So especially Ionian stories represent a different model, which shows more complexity, sometimes even a subversive approach. And she's also open to a diachronic development, even though it's mainly focused on the 6th and 5th centuries. Now, my personal approach to foundation narratives is very much drawing on these three scholars, but I would like to put the emphasis even more strongly on ethnic identity as being defined or redefined in these narratives. And often this happens in relation, in correlation to the various ethnics or groups that are on the grounds. I'm looking for specifics, but also general patterns that allow us to or that we can identify in these narratives and that allow us to connect with history on the ground. And I would like to pay more attention to competition amongst various Greek agents on the one hand, and also various local groups on the other hand. Of course, it's a commonplace now in any ethnographic studies to distinguish more clearly between emic and etic perspective. That's internal or external descriptions. I'd like to identify migrating narrative patterns or elements. I'd also like to identify larger ideological trends that change the master narratives and then also the specific narratives. So at the end of the day, I'm aiming for a typology of narrative patterns and also time-specific trends. So here see a very rough timeline from the Bronze Age to basically the present days, and some phrased in ways that describe the specific connection or specific perspectives, specific agents in colonial activities. I have boldened those areas on which I've done some research, and I've further underlined the Hellenistic period that I want to focus on today. And I can already point out that a very specific novelty of the Hellenistic period is, of course, the very strong dynastic factor that comes into play. But let us now move on to two examples from the Archaic period. I start with the Odyssey and the Argonautica, which are very closely connected because they intersect, and the earliest knowledge we have of the Argonautica comes from the Odyssey. Now, it's a traditional view in scholarship that the destination or the main destination of the Urings, both of the Argonauts and of Odysseus, led to the Black Sea. So Aia of the Argonauts and Aiaia, the island of Kirke or Hades, are mostly located in scholarship, but also in ancient discourses in the Black Sea. But I I doubt that this was the original location. And in one of my forthcoming articles, I argue systematically that it's very unlikely that the Greeks located mysterious places in the Black Sea in the late 8th century, when Black Sea exploration only started in the mid 7th century. So I have reinvestigated our oldest sources and have come to the conclusion that they all point to the west, to the area around Italy and Sicily to begin with. And we then see gradual migrations of mythical landscapes. So this slide is meant to lure you into the myth of Phrixus and the Argonauts. We see here Phrixus, who is about to be sacrificed by his father Atamas, then being saved by the golden fleeced ram, and he escapes with his sister Hele, who then falls into the Hellespont. And so this is already a version that directs us to the Black Sea. The Argonauts later on their quest for the Golden Fleece. Here, Jason, the hero, being supported by Medea. Then Jason in his fight with the dragons. And finally, he returns after completing his request, giving the Golden Fleece to his uncle. So why am I trying to, why am I bringing up this whole story? Now, I was interested in locating one of the most important Greek cities in the Black Sea, in the Eastern Black Sea, Dioscurias, which to this day has not been firmly identified, even though most scholars, and traditionally it's been located in modern Sukhumi. But when I worked through the ancient evidence, I felt this does not work. There is a very significant disconnect. And then I found out that Dioscurias plays an outstanding role in the location or identification of ancient places with Aya. Aya, the mythical kingdom of Aietes, the home of Medea. And in a set of articles, I have explained how the Greek mythical landscape on the one hand and the immediate environs of Dioscurias are merged in our literary tradition. What I further argue is that there was not just one ancient Greek or foreign city that was identified with Aya, and sometimes it's argued that this one city should actually be Kutaisi, a non-Greek city in Georgia, up the Rioni River, but rather there we see a migration of identified places, places identified with Aya. And the most interesting thing that I'd like to point out here is that specific features of the river, land, and ethnoscape of Dioscurias has been included into the new landscape. So we see this happening, and largely we are drawing on literary sources, but there is very complex evidence that shows what was happening. My latest discovery in this regard is that Trapezus in Pontus, northeastern Asia Minor, theoretically located somewhere here, if this is the Black Sea, has in fact ended up in the northeastern corner of the Black Sea on the Tabula Peutingeriana, an ancient map which we have in its medieval copy. And scholars have previously said, well, that's one of the typical inaccuracies of the Tabula Peutingeriana. A lot has been moved to different places, but no, this move is very specific and very meaningful. In fact, Trapezus has here taken on the position of Dioscurias. And when we look into the literary descriptions of Trapezus and its environs, we also see that some of the elements of Dioscurias or of Kolchis and the other Ai in central Kolchis have been transported to the environments of Trapezus. This is why we see starting around 400 that Trapezus is said to be in or by Kolchis. I give you two examples. So in Xenophon's Anabasis, we see the Kolkhoi as immediate neighbors of the Trapezuantes. What we also see in Strabo is that the Sannoi are the people living around Dioscurias and being named as the founders of Dioscurias, that they are identified with the Macrones living in the hinterland of Trapezus. And in Pliny, we see added to them also the Heniokoi. Heniokoi means the charioteers, and this goes back to the legend that the neighboring ethnic to Dioscurias had been founded by Amphitos and Thelchios, the charioteers of the Dioscuroi, Castor and Pollux. So, and a final example from the tabula itself, the Sannoi, also sometimes occurring in the version of Sanigai, Suani, or Suani Sarmate, they are multiplied. Because of these movements and these virtual migrations, we see certain people showing up in very different places. So that was an example to show the long-term interaction of literary traditions on the one hand and encounters, experiences on the ground, local names, ethnics, intruding into mythical or legendary Greek narratives. My next example is on the Phocaian Apoikia Massalia, Marseille today. And unfortunately, all the extant sources, or the most important extant sources, are very late. So Athenaios and Justin are our main sources in the imperial period, but Athenaios gives us a decent fragment from Aristotle, taking us back to the 4th century BCE. And Justin's source is known to be Pompeius Trogus, and here specifically there is reference to not just Trogus himself, but also his father and grandfather, who are connected to the area of Marseille. Otherwise, there are a few other fragments or passing references which are also important, but for the narrative of the foundation, I think we should start with Aristotle. For time purposes, I'm not reading this out, but I go to the schematic view that I've prepared for you. So the narrative that Aristotle presents us has the local, King Nannos, who is the father of a girl, Peta, or a virgin, who is up for marriage. And when her wedding ceremony starts, a Greek friend arrives. Euxenos is his name. He has a speaking name, the good host, the good friend. And the wedding ceremony foresees that Peta is supposed to give one of the suitors whom she wants to pick a bowl of wine. And so she chooses Euxenos. The two become a married couple, and their offspring, their first son, is Protis, who would then be the ancestor of the Protiadae, a group of the Massaliots that we can identify in 5th century Massalia. Justin has a somewhat different version. He gives us two Greek founders. The one is Simos, a Greek name, and the daughter, and the other Protis. So he's no longer the son of a mixed marriage, but one of the Greek settlers. By the way, also a speaking name. It has Protos, the first, as its root. And then we have another name for the daughter of Nannos, Gyptis. This is an opaque name. It may be Celtic or Gaulish, but I have not been able to identify a Gaulish etymology. It is neither Greek. Now this couple is then said to be the ancestors of all the Massaliots. Now, both versions are clearly concerned with a connection to the land through intermarriage. And in both versions, we also see that various older versions have been conflated, older and younger versions. I think we still see the Proteadic view shining through the text of Aristotle, that is an elite group amongst the earlier Massaliots who want to express their special status. And what I suggest is that the Proteadae claimed their descent from the first Greek settlers and the locals to distinguish themselves from later, probably Aeolian settlers who came around 500. And we have other evidence, not just for their arrival, but also for disputes about the ethnic identity, whether the Massaliots were Ionian or Aeolian. And let me move on to Justin's version. We also have very wide mixes of old and young. We have a very strong Roman frameworks. Now the Romans have interactions with the Massaliots from early on. Of course, that is a late addition. But then we also, and one indirect Roman trace is the Roman tendency to emphasize much more the Greeks as bringers of civilization. So we see that the goals are presented as much fiercer in Justin's account. And we also see that Gyptis is offering Protis only water because the Gauls, before the arrivals of the Greeks, did not yet know viticulture and wine. But then I also identify older elements. I do think that Simos, a Greek name, and Gyptis, an unidentified, possibly Celtic name, that they represent an older version before, in a younger version, speaking names were given to these individuals. So when we look and when we compare different versions, we can easily identify older and younger versions. Another change that I identify is the fact that Protis has moved up, so he's no longer the son of a mixed marriage. And I do think that this is a result of the Athenian turn. The Massaliots, in one version, not precisely in the version that then has ended up in Justin's account, but in one version, the descendants of Protis claim to be of pure Greek descent rather than of mixed origin. But this is a version in which the Proteadae no longer played a role in Massalia, so Proteadae are not mentioned in Justin's account. So I have to leave this example at that, but I try to tease out some conclusions. When we look at such stories, we see that the Greek settlers try in multiple ways to establish their links to the land, to establish some kind of legitimacy. There may be oracles, friendship, alliance, weddings, or heroic status that helps with it. But then we also see some kind of fluidity of ethnic identity, and one that goes beyond dichotomy, Greek and barbarian. So within the very individual narratives, we often see hierarchies. Interesting in the Argonautic case, the Dioskuroi take the highest level in all the accounts on Dioskurias, for example. The Heniokoi are also Greeks, but at a somewhat lower level. The Archaioi then are said to be, well, more common folks descending from the Greeks, but intermixed with locals and much lower on the ethnic scale. And the Kolchoi then are the pure barbarians, often also presented as pirates. With the Phocians in Massalia, we see more such of a distinction between the Gauls. There are good Gauls, the Segobrigii, and bad Gauls. And there is another level, intermediate level, which we can find in the daughter, who, at least in the account of Aristotle, is already very much Hellenized even before the arrival of the Greeks. So we see a play with these different levels. But then when we try to identify various time levels, the whole picture becomes much more complex. I remind you of the example of migrating Aya, migrating Argonautic land and river and ethnoscapes, which constantly moved identifications of historical people known to ethnographers, geographers, and their relation with mythical ancestors. In the case of the Greeks of Massalia, we also see how much the distinction between Aeolian and Ionian matters. We may see some historical progression in the renaming of the daughter of Nannos. I think in the earliest accounts she was called Gyptis. Then she was given a Gaulish telling name, a speaking name, Peta, which encapsulates the etymology of asking, the asker, or the demander, the one who picks her husband. And finally, the Greek-speaking name Aristoxene. And of course, also a very late element is the inclusion of the Romans, directly but also indirectly with some Roman ideological perspectives. Okay, so I now move on to the Seleukid foundation stories. The Seleukids, the four main cities of northern Syria, Antioch on the Orontes, Seleucia in Pieria, Apamea and Laodicea. They were all founded around 300 after the Battle of Ipsos, after Seleucus had defeated Antigonos together with his allies. And I have recently written about not so much about the victory itself, but rather about the ensuing diplomatic and military interactions. And my recent thesis is that Seleucus was in fact able to free a long time for peace for the Seleukid kingdom. It was so for nearly 15 years or so, the kingdom was in peace with its competitors so that he could really concentrate on the foundation of these cities. We learn most about these cities through Strabo, but also Libanius. And perhaps the most detailed account is also our latest, John Malalas, who draws on Pausanias of Antioch, an author who is lost to us and only known through large fragments. We now, through most recent research, we have excellent access to his work, thanks to David Engels and Chiara Grigolin, who have contributed a nearly book-length discussion of Pausanias in the latest edition of the Fragmente der griechischen Historiker Continued, which is edited by Stefan Schorn. This volume, the relevant volume, in cooperation again with David Engels. Our other main pieces of scholarship are, of course, the important work by Getzel Cohen and Daniel Ogden for the legendary sites. So if I have to summarize the long narrative and point out that in the late narrative of John Malalas, we see a conflation of so many different ideologies from so many different centuries. Well, we see that immediately when the foundations are being approached. The narrative of Seleucus starts with Alexander having assigned Syria to Seleucus. So that is a more peaceful legitimacy. But then Antigonos Monophthalmos is presented. Actually, he is here conflated with his own son. He's not called Antigonos Monophthalmos, but Antigonos Polyorketes. Anyways, he is presented as encroaching into the territories of Seleucus, so that there had to be war, and Seleucus had to conquer back his territories. And once he had that, he was marching through his territories, seeing small settlements, and then being inspired by those locations and trying to establish much larger ones. And here you have most of the texts I cannot read them out to you, but I have condensed the information into a comparative table. So we have the 4 cities, Seleucia, Antioch, Laodicea, and Apamea, and we see very similar patterns. There is always a sacrifice. In fact, in all 4 cases, we hear of the sacrifice of a bull to Zeus with minor variation. And the master narrative then is that an eagle of Zeus comes, takes part of the meat, and delivers it to the place which then becomes the settlement ground. For Antioch, we have the same, nearly the same version, and that's quite interesting. We do know that the prime narrative for Antioch in other versions is that it's not just meat, but the bucranium, the head of the bull, has been carried away by the eagle. And when the bull sacrifice is complemented in the case of Laodicea by a boar that Seleucus hunted, and then although the eagle carries the meat to that place, it's then also Seleucus who carries the boar to this place, and the blood of the boar then is used to mark out all the territory, to encircle the territory of Laodicea. And for Apamea, we have a conflation of many of these elements. We have the bull sacrifice, then we have a goat sacrifice conflated. In both cases, the eagle takes parts of the meat, brings it to the new places, and then also blood of these animals is used to mark out the settlement. So we see a conflation of various traditions. In fact, there is a very late tradition that we can trace for Antioch and Laodicea. We hear of sacrifices of local girls, Aimatia in the case of Antioch, and Agawe in the case of Laodicea. Now, these sacrifices are very late Christian anti-pagan elements. When it comes to the settlement grounds, we hear first that Seleucus saw a small city that had been founded by Cyrus, a son of Agenor, the mythical king of Tyre, and also the father of the more famous Cadmos, the founder of Thebes. But there's a second settlement which has the name Pieria, which is named after a Macedonian landscape. So, but no founder is named. We should, however, extrapolate that this tradition will also claims a connection to Macedon proper. For Antioch, it's most complex again. There is mention of Iopolis, which of course connects this foundation with Io, the daughter of the river god Inachos from Argos. So the Argive tradition is then expressed in multiple ways. Kassos is seen as a son of Inachos, as a founder is mentioned, but he's in fact not given most prominence in for Iopolis. It's rather Perseus who also hails from Argos. But Kassos then reappears connected with many other ethnics that are mentioned, not just the Argives themselves, but then there are further ethnics mentioned that were present in Antigonea, obviously a foundation of Antigonos, but here these ethnics are given a much older presence. We have Athenians, we have Macedonians, we have Cretans, and the Cretans are said to have been invited by Kassos as his mercenaries. And we have Cypriots, and they are connected to the wife of Kassos, a princess from Cyprus, who has two different names, Amyke or Kitia, the daughter of Sasalaminos, and that name reminds of Salamis on Cyprus. Yet there is another settlement called Botia, again after a Macedonian landscape. There is a different strategy for Laodicea and Apamea. We just have a name of a foundation, and these names are obviously Iranian or Persian, Madzabda and Pharnake, but there is no comment made of these or of the ethnics living there. So we can see that there is a template of foundation stories that then intermixes with specifics. Seleucus is regularly empowered by Alexander, but he also acts as a victor over Antigonus. He's attracted by pre-existing, typically small settlements. He's then directed by Zeus, typically through a bull sacrifice, though with variation. He enters a landscape that is already immersed in Greek mythology. So Seleucus is then not the first Greek, and none of the Hellenistic Greeks were the first. There had been a long mythical Greek history in those narratives. And then something very important, Seleucus is the one who merges all the people into one. Macedonian, Greeks, Persians, Cypriots, or Syrians. That is very important. Now, if we resume the analytical table that I've used for the earliest examples, we see we can add some elements, some examples. First, to how the relation to the land is established. Alexander does play one role. The miraculous sacrifice is very important. But then the dynastic name, Seleucus and names of his family play outstanding roles for connecting the Greek newcomers with the dynasty, and through the dynasty with the land. Plus heroes, typically Greek heroes, which are also important. When it comes to ethnic identity within these narratives, we regularly see kind of an egalitarian fusion of the peoples who were there. We see clearly Macedonians and Greeks, and sometimes we see others, though the others are often not very clearly identified, but hinted at as non-Greeks. When we then try to differentiate out on a chronological scale these narratives, we do see that specific changes has happened when the dynasty changed. So the dynastic aspect is important, not just for a synchronic view, but also for a diachronic view, the change of rulers or the change of a ruling house, more importantly, brought about change. And in brackets, I mentioned that the change of cults also could change the narrative. The human sacrifices are examples for that. We can dig deeper, and I've now two more examples, one from Antioch and one from Apamea, to allow us to tease out the diachronic perspective with more and sharper detail. I first relate to the Antioch foundation mosaic, which is quite famous recently, but it's the result of an illegal excavation, and it's lost. We only have this image which is circulating, and I give you the most relevant references here. And we see a beautiful large-scale representation of the foundational sacrifice. And the wonderful thing of this mosaic is that it not only gives us individuals, in fact, I think we would have been able to identify most of them through the iconography, but we have the additional legends, but let me speak of inscriptions so that I don't confuse or cause any confusion with the ambivalent term of legend. So from left to right, we have ktisis. That's the personification of foundation from the verb ktidzein. We have Antiochus, obviously, Antiochus I, the son of Seleucus, who is on the other side. They both are sacrificing. The father Seleucus in a somewhat more prominent role and with a somewhat larger fiale pouring wine into the fire. Of course, I must not fail to mention the eagle holding the bucranium, the bull head. And then we have to the immediate left or on our right of Seleucus, we have another female figure. And unfortunately, there is a damage to the mosaic so that she is not named, and she would be the most interesting perhaps for us to know. There is debate whether this is the foundation of Antioch or Apamea. So some claim that she is the personification of Antiocheia. I doubt this because if we continue the line, Antiocheia would take up too many, would need too many letters, take up too much space. Apama might be an interesting guess for those who claim that this is in fact Apameia, not Antioch. I doubt this. Tyche might be a good guess. And then we have Heracles, who from relatively early on was connected with the foundation myth of Antioch, especially through his agency in Daphne, the main sanctuary city of Antioch. So I first told you what we do see, but very interesting is also what we do not see. We do not see any reference to Antigonos or Antigonea. We do not see any reference to any other non-Seleucid diadoch or Hellenistic ruler. In fact, we do not have any reference to a non-Greek native either. And the myth that has been chosen is one of the most Greek myths, and it's one of the less inclusive myths. With less inclusive, what I mean with less exclusive is clear when we look at the Tyrian king Agenor and his sons. So they would include Syrians, for example. So this is a version, it reflects a version probably from the third, perhaps the later 3rd century under Antiochus III, which is strongly Hellenocentric. If we now differentiate our table, we have the miraculous sacrifice as a very important element, the dynastic name, and the Greek hero. When we go to how ethnics are described, I bracketed the egalitarian fusion because we do not see much diversity that is then merged together. Perhaps this is egalitarian because it's already fused, but I want to be clear, non-Greeks are invisible. So some questions arise here. What we do see, if we put this piece of evidence into our longer term, into our diachronic perspective, the dynastic filter is very strict. I'd also say within the dynasty of the Seleukids, it's interesting to see how Antiochus has been brought into the picture at a slightly lower scale than Seleucus, but that may be because of the name of Antioch, but it may also be that many scholars agree that most of the foundational myths were forged, or the earlier versions were forged under Antiochus I. I actually think that some of the myth-making or legend-making goes back to Seleucus himself, and then there were adjustments under Antiochus I and major adjustments under Antiochus III and then the fourth, if we include all the evidence. Let's now move quickly for the last few minutes to the Apameia, to the case of Apameia on the Orontes. The situation of Apameia is very specific on a peninsula in the wild, water-rich Orontes River. So it's defined by all the pastures in its environment. And the pastures were used, amongst others, for the elephant herd. 500 elephants of the Seleukids were there, but not just elephants, also the cavalry was stationed there, the horse breeds, 30,000 mares were said to have been hosted there or bred there. But we learn further from Strabo, whom I'm quoting here, that the first name, Macedonian name, was actually Pella. And this is explained with Pella as being the home of Philip and Alexander, and thus the metropolis of all Macedonians, so much more correct than the version in Malalas, who pretends that Pella was the home of Seleucus more specifically. So the notion of horse breeding, the name of Pella, they also play a role in the epic of Oppian, the Kynegetica from the late 3rd century AD. And in a digression, he speaks about a very early phase of the history of the city, Archippos, who is understood to be the founder, is presented as the first king of Pella, and he calls in for help his friend Heracles, who would then carve out the Keronesos, that is the peninsula. And then it is said that one name, an early name of Apamea, was also Keronesos. And this version, or the original of this epic, is ascribed by most scholars to Euphorion of Kolchis, who worked and lived under Antiochus III. Now, what we can see so far is that by around 200, an Achaemenid prehistory was completely obliterated. The name of Pharnake, which was in some early sources so that Pausanias and Malalas could find them, obliterated. The agency of Antigonos obliterated, even though it's most likely that he gave the name Pella to the place, and then Seleucus changed the name to the dynastic name Apamea. And we see by then the invention of Greek heroes, not just to establish a connection of Greeks and Macedonians with the land, but also specifically to supersede non-dynastic or non-Greek earlier founders. We can go even further thanks to the spectacular Apamea foundation mosaics, about which I presented some 3 years ago also in this lecture series, and I cannot repeat the whole lecture, and I just focus on a few items, but the full and extended version is soon forthcoming in a Festschrift. You have some reference, and you can ask me later. The Apamea Foundation mosaic in its upper registry also has the foundational sacrifice. But we do not see, well, again, we have named agents, and we see Kassandros, the son of Antipatros, and then the main king with a purple cape and a diadem is named Archippos. So based on this mosaic, Olszewski argued that in fact we should assume that Archippos was a historical founder. He was subordinate to Kassandros. Kassandros, the official founder, some of the glory also going to his father Antipatros, but the effective officer who led the undertaking was a certain Archippos. I very much doubt this. I still follow the view of Hollis that Archippos is a speaking name, a telling name. He is very likely an artificial creation, as the horse ruler. Connect that with what I've just told you, a drawing on Strabo. Cohen also follows this traditional interpretation. Cosmin is undecided. But then I ask, why would a courtier of Antiochus III make an official of Kassandros, or even Kassandros or Antipatros? Well, no, we have in Oppian, and that this way also in Euphorion, the name of Archippos. Why would there be an interest in drawing on Archippos if he had been a subordinate officer of Kassandros or Antipatros? I rather think it's much more plausible to assume that in a very early stage, perhaps still under Seleucus, Antigonos as the main founder was replaced by Antipatros, who was held in high esteem under Seleucus, and then also Antipatros together with his son Kassandros, who for a very short while was subordinate to Antigonos, but it's an easy way to exclude Antigonos from the narrative. We then see that Heracles is brought into the narrative, and that seems to be a copycat from the Daphne narrative, where he plays a much more important role. And alternatively, we have Archippos, so an artificial figure with a speaking name, but this figure is then connected with Heracles as a friend, and I think that is what Euphorion finally did. So most of this interpretation was just dwelling on the literary tradition and the written names that we have. But as I argued 3 years ago, the iconography is very different from the inscribed names. I cannot make the argument here, that would take too much time, but the result of my iconographical interpretation is that the soldier whose helmet we see here on the left of the fragment was in fact Antiochos, probably coming right from the battlefield of Ipsos. And the founding king was probably Seleucus, and the mythical hero assisting is the old man Archippos. So that would be my interpretation here. In the next registry, we have a similar disconnect between the iconography and the written names. The written names are Seleukos, then Antipatros, then Archippos, then Apama. Of course, we have to do with Apamea, so it makes a lot of sense to have her here. Then Kassandros and Antiochos the First. That's how it's been interpreted by Olszewski and Saad, the first in the earliest publications. But there are so many problems. Let us just focus on one. Who has diadems? We have 4 diademed figures. So the Seleucus figure, the Archippos figure, Apama, and alleged Antiochos. But when we then look more closely at Archippos, he is in such a close connection with Apama as if they were family. It's very and he is a young man. He's not an old hero. So this does not really make sense, as so many other things do not make sense. I came up 3 years ago with the interpretation that this, in fact, is not Archippos, but Antiochus, the son of Seleucus and Apama, and also the successor. 3 years ago, I suggested that this young man, this is a young teenager. It's not the grown-up son, Antiochus, that he was the younger brother for whom we have epigraphic attestation. But my most recent research, then I still referred to the reigning triad that we would see here illustrated. But in fact, I now think that we have the first 3 generations of Seleukid rulers, this being Seleucus, the son of Antiochus I, and co-ruling king. And here we have Seleucus as the divinized king with the horns. So this is what I think the iconography represents, and it may have been created under Antiochus I. Okay, what we do see then when we look into late antiquity, so we have late antique mosaics, we see an iconography that's very old, but with the legends we see a complete mix-up, an ahistorical, anti-dynastic presentation of the traditions. And that can be explained by the desire of the city to be nobilitated by every single hero or king or queen that plays an important role in the tradition. If we try to condense everything, we then see that the connection through the land in the Hellenistic, in the Seleukid narratives have strongly divine, heroic, and dynastic components. When it comes to ethnic identity, we see that especially in the earlier versions, we should speak of invisible non-Greeks, but also invisible non-Seleukid settlers, or they are disconnected quite quickly from the predecessors of Seleucus. So we see in a diachronic perspective a very strong dynastic filter working through the 3rd century. But we further see that the dynastic emphasis diffuses after Seleukid rule. So it's more about the nobility of the city that is in the foreground. And what we do see is a change or a widening of the scope of heroes. We see more inclusive, ethnically more inclusive heroes, those who can include Persians or Syrians. And in the very late phase, that's in the 6th century, we even see pre-Greek Persian names reappear. I'm nearly ready. I'm sorry I've been a little lengthy, but I want to and with one important question, one question that we've been discussing so often in this Seleukid group, namely, how inclusive or how exclusive were the Seleukids with the natives? We've discussed that when we were looking at cult practices, where we see that the Seleukids were very willing to cooperate and to see commonalities between local cults and Greek cults or central cults. And we've discussed this question more recently when we had a focus on the Seleukid army and recruitment practices, when we discussed the notion of Macedonians. Who were the Macedonians as a status marker, or was it still narrowly ethnically Macedonian? And I think most of us agreed that, in fact, early in the 3rd century, many non-Macedonians could first be armed as Macedonians and then ever more often also be named or labeled as Macedonians and then be settled with other Macedonians. So that's the question. How should we then relate the absence or the invisibility of non-Greek Greco-Macedonians in the Seleukid time layer or in the narratives of Seleukid time layers? So I would argue for an inclusive reading. I would argue that, well, many of the locals, even in early times, had become Macedonian. So there was a pathway into becoming Macedonian through the army. And also one thing I would like to mention, I have not yet mentioned before, if we compare the narratives in more detail, say with the narratives of the Argonauts or of the Massaliots, we see natives as inimical, as wild, as dangerous. So there is also an absence of native dwellers as dangers, as risk. They are not the enemies. When there are obstacles, these are natural forces, such as the wild Orontes River or dangerous, fierce-looking rocks. They are the opponents. So that allows us also to embrace a much more inclusive reading. And towards the end, I would also say that at a certain point, and that's something I'd like to, I hope that my research will help me find out, when the more inclusive heroes such as Perseus, Cyrus, and Io were introduced into the narratives to open up the scope, to also integrate more explicitly the locals into the Seleukid ethnic construct. Thank you very much. Now, Richard, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you very much, Altay. Can everybody hear me? Yes? Can everybody hear me?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, I'm back. I must have
Yes.
frozen. Okay. Yeah, once again, thank you very much, Altay, for kicking off a very wide-ranging and very interesting discussion, and one that I think is obviously significant for how we read certain kinds of texts, particularly, obviously, these colonial foundation narratives as evidence. And as everyone here, I think, is without doubt aware, this textual evidence, evidence that we must, I think, perforce work with, is all too patchy, obviously not written with us in mind either. So wrestling with how these texts are constructed, who the intended readers are, their cultural and intellectual predilections and assumptions, questions of intertextuality, layers of composition, contradictions, silences, and so on, are all vital, obviously, to textual interpretation, and so vital for getting as much historical evidence out of this otherwise very limited material as we can possibly get. So you've obviously undertaken a deconstruction of Seleukid foundation narratives, focusing primarily on the Tetrapolis and trying to situate those narratives within the broader sort of literary tradition of colonization narratives more generally. And of course, anyone who's worked with these narratives, I think, can attest they're extremely frustrating to work with. So the work that you're doing here, I think, is important. Um, by examining other sort of earlier archaic colonization narratives, you've identified a taxonomy or set of commonplaces, literary tropes, in other words, in many of these narratives. So the authorization of colonial foundations through an oracle and a local woman, a shared mythical pedigree between the founders and local indigenous populations, and so on. And you've suggested that these tropes might, in part, have shaped Seleukid foundation stories as well. I am a little skeptical about this. You wanted disagreement, so or controversy. I have to confess, I had to struggle to find points of controversy and disagreement. I've generally found much of what you've said here congenial, but I am a little bit skeptical about the comparison that you've tried to make. Although, to be fair, you don't push this comparison too far, in my opinion. More on that later. But you do rightly note that there are a number of uniquely Seleukid tropes, which you've, I think, indicated originate in the Seleukid court. And you've also been able to identify these sorts of layers of construction under both archaic colonization narratives and Seleukid colonization narratives, respectively, which you've argued is evidence for both the fluidity of these narrative foundation stories and how they might be used to establish claims to land and articulate relations between Greeks and non-Greeks, and certainly in the archaic context, and mutatis mutandis, Seleukid claims to royal legitimacy in the region of the Tetrapolis. Most valuably, I think you've attempted this diachronic reading of these foundation narratives of cities that become Seleukid cities by comparing the foundation narratives from Malalas, obviously the main source for Seleukid foundation stories, to other sources, Strabo, Oppian, evidence from the mosaics that you had discussed earlier or later in your talk, I should say. And this diachronic analysis, I think, not only underscores the fluidity of these narratives, but also reveals how figures like Seleucus I erased his competitors from the landscape in Syria while possibly integrating Greek, Macedonian, and local populations and identities into this Seleukid claims to royal legitimacy. And finally, I've noted that you've identified several layers that can sort of be disambiguated in these Seleukid foundation narratives that can be used to chart the evolution and development of Seleukid royal ideology. The foundation mosaic, of course, is particularly helpful in this regard. You've undertaken then, I think, a very subtle and nuanced reading of these narratives, and you've revealed the complexity of their construction. Obviously, this is exceedingly difficult because there is so much missing context, and I'll be addressing that momentarily. But you've done, I think, a great job in attempting to recover that context, I think. I would suggest that, or I might suggest that a fuller engagement with the world of literary theory, narratology, analysis of sort of possible folkloric elements and so on would be fruitful here. Obviously, your reference to Carol Doherty's work suggests that you're already, of course, moving in that direction, but perhaps that could be articulated a little bit more clearly. I'd note that the comparison between the foundation narratives for archaic colonies and those of Hellenistic colonies were, as you've noted, in fact, produced under conditions that were really quite different. So aside from the obviously different geopolitical contexts, city foundations in the archaic and Hellenistic periods occur for quite different reasons and served quite different purposes, I think. And the reasons for establishing colonies in the Archaic period, of course, were highly varied, far more varied, perhaps, than is the case for the Hellenistic period. And as you've noted, the imperial and dynastic elements, which are so prominent for Hellenistic city foundations are largely missing for the Archaic period. So because the contexts for Archaic and Hellenistic city foundations are so different, I think you need to be maybe a little clearer about how these differences might affect the construction of those foundation narratives. In other words, are the comparisons apt, right, methodologically speaking, or are we talking about really apples and oranges here? Additionally, I'd note that you left out any discussion of the foundation narrative of Seleucia on Tigris as outlined in Appian. I recognize, of course, that you focused your discussion on the Tetrapolis, and obviously such limitations, although they have a kind of inorganic feeling or quality to them, are obviously necessary and purely practical or pragmatic. I suspect, of course, that the study is large enough already and would become unwieldy, of course, if you were to expand it beyond expand the project beyond its current limits. But the story of Seleucia on Tigris seems to be something of an outlier, certainly when compared to the other narrative tropes that you've articulated today. Ogden and Cosman, of course, have addressed this narrative in some detail, but certainly it doesn't seem to fit the narrative pattern that you are discussing today. So I think perhaps you might want to address that as well. There's no sacrifice scene. There's no eagle snatching sacrificial meat and so on in that particular narrative. So where does that narrative then fit into the sort of typology that you're trying to establish? And then finally, I wonder if you might be able to give a little more attention to and you do touch on this, to the discursive way such foundation narratives emerge or are formed. You've already identified effectively two interlocutors in these narratives, pre-existing colonization narratives and their concomitant tropes, although, as I said, that requires some additional clarification, and the Seleukid court itself, right? Missing from the discussion, however, perhaps is a fuller account of local voices or interests. And as again, you do note that these silences are in and of themselves relevant. But how do these narratives respond to local interests and local conditions, right? These cities are founded and located in particular communities with particular interests. Often they involve the movement of populations, the displacement of populations and peoples. And so presumably the form that these narratives take are meant to answer to those local concerns and local conditions. So are the people erased? Are those local voices undermined? Are they accommodated? It's not always, of course, possible, given the state of the evidence, to locate those local interests. So in the context of the Tetrapolis, I might ask, how you might go about trying to do that. If you think it's important to do so, I think I know the answer to that already. But how you might go about trying to establish that context. And so I've blathered on long enough. I threw a million questions at you, so I'll leave it there. And then let you respond.
Thank you very much, Richard. That was very helpful. I think most of the things you said initially were probably helping the audience to summarize and come to grips with the many things that I have addressed. You have tried to, group my arguments, my perspectives a little bit new and make them more accessible. But there was largely, I think, agreement. And so I concentrate on a few points that I've identified where there is more need of discussion or clarification. One of well, a big question that you raised was that of how valid is the comparison of these different narratives from different times. So in my diachronic approach, you have rightly seen that I'm, on the one hand, trying to follow up on very specific foundation stories, say Argonautic stories or the story of Massalia through the ages, how that very specific narrative develops. But then I also aim for a much broader perspective, looking at how Greek foundation narratives develop overall through the ages. But then we have to deal with some narratives hailing from the Archaic period, or from the Classical period, or from the Hellenistic, or Roman, or even Christian periods. And how justified is it to compare them? And of course, I have to be cautious. I have to be alert to all potential differences on the one hand. On the other hand, I do see very clear themes and elements that continue. And I have tried to show through the examples that I've given that it makes sense to compare not just for continuity, but also for discontinuity, because we gain a much clearer understanding. So I do see that there is a significant difference, as you also acknowledged, for the Seleukid foundation myths, the central importance of the dynastic role and name, the agency of the king, perhaps also some family members, but mainly the founding king, and then his names and the names of his family members become essential. And then they are connected with the essential sacrifice, sometimes oracle, and with the land itself. So the king and his family is at the core of everything, and that's very new. But understanding that, it's quite interesting then to ask questions, but what happens to the locals? How is their representation changed? And I admit my focus was largely on how is the representation of local ethnics changing, or how are they represented in what is a Greek narrative, a Greek, a Greco-Macedonian, later even a Greco-Macedonian Roman narrative. We are so highly dependent on the Greek, Greco-Roman side that very often we just do not have these voices we want to have. Though what I try to be as alert as possible to possible traces of these voices. The one most intriguing example that I have found is in the case of Massalia. I'm the first to suggest that Petta is in fact Celtic and a Celtic speaking name, and that it represents an idea that may even go back. So I'm speculating here. I have to do more research. I have not followed up on potential parallels of brides picking her husband by offering a drink. I think it's a very artificial concept, and I do not know in how far that may or may not be Gaulish, as I've read somewhere. But the notion that this girl has a speaking Gaulish and not Greek name that relates to the selection has given me the idea that there may have been an early Gaulish narrative that says, well, we have chosen you, we are partners. That might be such a trace. So I have to do more research to support this speculation, and it's not much more than a speculation at this time, but it would be a new perspective. What I'm also doing, and I have not, but I am relatively new in the sphere of mythical studies, epics, and so on. Yes, I've been doing some research, reading a little bit, but the distinction between more purely Greek heroes and more inclusive heroes is also something that only I became aware of by looking at the various time levels. seeing Heracles and Archippos very early in our evidence, and the others later. I do not know how late, so I have to follow up on many more fragments to see when, for example, Syros and Antenor, or Perseus start to play a role in those Seleukid foundation stories. But then again, I have to admit, these are Greek perspectives. I think the best that I realistically hope for is to describe a narrative discourse and a narrative development that pays a lot of attention to the different ethnics, Greek, Macedonians, and non-Greeks, and trying to present them in kind of an inclusive way, but also geared towards a mainly Greek audience. So the main audience, I think, is still Greco-Macedonian, although I do think that very quickly natives were being integrated into these ethnics. I think in the polis and in the army, we very from an early stage onwards, we see a desire to be also Macedonian or Greek, and then to be seen as part of it. And the more inclusive heroes would at least be a reflection of the larger diversity that was there, while at the end of the day, these narratives, the legends we have, always end with a merger. There is unity. So there is not no longer an emphasis on distinction or diversity, but in fact, it's becoming one people, though they have different roots. So that is what I'm seeing right now, and I would love to find more clues and traces, but also broadening my perspective. I may find more visual representations that have more local colorit. That is a possibility. So, and I hope that expanding the network, that finding collaborators that say, well, I'm interested in this or that specific case study, that we will widen the scope. That brings me to the next point, the question of literary tradition. So you are right, I have to do more, and I will do more. I'm collecting readings. My bibliography or my to-do list is growing constantly to gain a better understanding, but also to see a much longer perspective, as I said, going into the 21st century. I hope that at some point there will also be some cooperation with scholars on or with First Nations here in Canada, and the foundation stories they have. And I would then like to go back and compare the foundation stories that are being transmitted in these local communities, compare them with the foundation stories that we have from the early colonizers and then through the centuries, and see what I can learn methodologically. Perhaps in both directions, we can learn methodologically to refine our understanding. My first intention is always trying to understand the evidence that we have and trying to see through the evidence into the ancient worlds, into the past, into, if even possible, into the minds of the peoples. And of course, more prevalent are the minds of those people who wrote or told these stories, and they did not give equal attention to everyone involved. So I will probably be disappointing because I cannot make up evidence that's not there, but I'm really very keen on looking very carefully at all the evidence I can find, and also going beyond the Tetrapolis, which of course, and going further to the east, and you mentioned Seleukia, to find examples where we have not just a uniquely Greek perspective. And with Seleukia on the Tigris, which I did not mention today, you are right, we have a narrative that's completely different. It does not fit the template on the one hand. On the other hand, it may in fact be one that may have a local perspective, because the Babylonian priests do play an outstanding role there. And I have offered a new interpretation of this in my concluding chapter, where I argue for a much more inclusive, respectful, and positive relation between Babylonians and Seleukids than has been hitherto done. Although there are many voices, but I would say I have joined those who emphasize positive relations, and I even include that narrative, which is somewhat new, but it is about generosity, and even the motivations of the Babylonians who try to undermine the sacrifice of Seleucus or manipulate it. Their intention is, hey, Seleucus, do not leave our city. We are afraid that you may leave it. And that is why Seleucus is responding gently. And there is forgiveness. And so the foundation of Seleucia on the Tigris does not result in the complete abandonment of Babylon. Babylon continues being a city of outstanding importance. So I do not yet want to commit myself as to how much of an indigenous perspective we have in that narrative that we know from Appian's Syrian book. Of course, it's a late version, 2nd century AD, and it's clearly a Greek perspective of that. But we have a very significant local agency, and very different from the templates. But something that's now coming to mind now that you are asking me and I start thinking about it, this narrative is not so much about Seleucia. It's actually not so much about the foundation of Seleucia on the Tigris. It's much more about trying to or coming to grips with the foundation of Seleucia from a Babylonian perspective. So perhaps there we may be able to open some space or to identify some local voices, but I want to be very cautious at this state. I think I have to refine my methodology, and especially I have to collect much more evidence and put it into tables and compare what we have, and then see how the slight differences may reflect meaning, may reflect different ethnic constructs or a redefinition of ethnic relations. So I think I have I addressed your main questions or your main points?
Yes, you've addressed them very nicely. I might dispute your interpretation of Appian's narrative, but at the risk of, or rather, in order to avoid occupying the floor, I'll refrain from doing that, and that's something that we can maybe discuss at another time, and I'll allow others to ask questions.
That's very kind of you. Thank you. And I will be very keen on discussing that further. So the floor is now open. If you, we are a small group. I think I see Marion. Yeah, Marion, please.
Yeah, speaking or trying to get clues for inclusion. I mean, I argued that it was Antiochus I who inaugurated a cult of the city of Antioch in Antiochia on the Orontes, and a statue, the personification of the city, was established. And only later sources connect this statue and the cult with the founder Seleucus. So I think it is very telling that in Seleucus' time, the gods, the divinities, the main divinities in Antioch, but also in Seleucia and Pieria, were, of course, Apollo and Zeus. Whereas the second generation, according to my interpretation, of course, gave the inhabitants this cult of Antiochia, of Antioch. So this, I think, means that, people who did not have a home anymore. The second generation, those who had not come from Macedonia and from Greece, but also all the other inhabitants of Antioch, they all were included into the service of one cult. They had a common divinity. They had a common cult recipient. They had a common point of reference. So I think this was much more inclusive than a traditional Greek Macedonian cult. And I think this is at least a clue to the attempt of the Seleukids in the second generation to acknowledge the fact that this was not Greece or Macedon anymore, that this was not a population consisting only of Greek-speaking people. And of course, this is my interpretation, because the later sources relate this statue to Seleukos and call it Tyche. But this is Malalas, almost 800, 900 years after the time I'm speaking about.
Thank you. That's a very good point. I do remember you spoke previously about the city goddess Antike, and you have convinced me very much. But it's worthwhile to emphasizing this unifying aspect as an alternative to the cult of Zeus or Apollo, even though one might probably also find some inclusive aspects of in these cults when, for example,
Sure.
there is specific mention of Zeus Cassius,
Of course.
which then relates to the mountain area. That I would also consider that an inclusive step.
Yes.
And that is, I think, for Seleukeia in Pieria. So that is very useful. I do know also that you are the expert of the iconography, and I'm still and I will look at your work again. But I wonder if you can even go a little further and say that the iconography of Antiocheia, which is so specific with her relation to the water, you explained that all to me, but is there anything specifically innovative or non-Greek that may have a local tradition? That would be most intriguing.
Well, it is the first Greek, so to say, statue, manufactured by a pupil of Lysippus, that has a new iconographic element, the mural crown, and this derives from the Near East. And there were, in Cyprus and in Cilicia, there had been coins with this element before. And I tried to trace the tradition. I mean, there is a Neo-Assyrian tradition of queens, and queens with names that refer to the city of Ashur. So there is a certain it's difficult to say local, but there is a non-Greek element in the creation of the statue, which it's not by chance that this iconography was introduced in that part of the Greek world, so to speak, and not, for example, in Western Asia Minor or in the mainland. So the knowledge of the visualization of a city by mural crown was, let's say, in a global sense, a Near Eastern tradition that we can trace, at least, as close in time to the Leukos as possible, to Cyprus in the 4th century. So there is a local aspect there, definitely.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's very helpful. And I think one can put in parallel also the creation of the Serapis cult in Egypt, which is in fact even more explicit and reveals so much more local input.
Yes.
But at least in a more in a milder reflection, we see similar efforts thanks to your interpretation, Marion. Are there other questions or comments?
Well, Altai, I'll just throw this out there then, if there are no others. Returning to the narrative in Appian, right? Is it not possible that what we're looking at is a kind of Seleukid repurposing of what was initially a resistance narrative. Appian, a local resistance narrative. I mean, Appian is quite specific about how the Magi bring forth this false oracle, or they lie about the oracle, precisely because the city is seen as a kind of bulwark against them, right? As a kind of set of fetters against them. And of course, we then have this story about divine intervention. The workers, the soldiers hear this voice at the appropriate hour in the city. Construction of the city then begins. Is it possible that we are dealing then with what was perhaps originally an attempt, and perhaps a widely known story, at least locally, that was then repurposed or converted into something that was perhaps more useful for the Seleucid court?
Well, it's a good question. And as you have phrased it with, is it possible? The answer is obviously yes, there are many possibilities. And I do think the story is already so remote from any plausible context that it reflects many ideological lenses and reformulations, additions, perhaps conflations of sometimes alternative or even conflicting traditions, that I would immediately concede the possibility. I would immediately concede the possibility, irrespective of that narrative, that there were oppositional forces to the Seleucid dynasty at some point. But I would also say that we have sufficient expression of loyalty, especially amongst the priests, and that I would rather say and assume that there was a very long continuity of loyalty towards the Seleucid family. I have listed many of the observations in my 2023 article on the efficacy of Seleucid ideology, where I have a full chapter on Babylon, and I see these elements from beginning to late, and it's quite outstanding. It's the beginning of Seleucid royalty, if you want, or Seleucid rule is so closely connected with Babylon as the seat of the first satrapy. But then also he's expelled, but he flees from Antigonus, but he has to come back to Babylon in order to reclaim his position as a successor, and he does so. And there is emphasis on the loyalty and support and the mutually good relations with the Babylonians. That's quite unique, that claim. So what at the least that we can say is a clear and a strong interest of the court to present that relation as very positive, very supportive. So that is the least we can say. I think that is also something you would not contradict to. You would just say, but how much meaning does it actually have when opposing interests are at stake? Would this loyalty still hold ground or not? That is then what you would challenge. But I think the overall evidence clearly points in a very positive, supportive relation. And when we have local revolts or local unrest, it's not against the kings. There's hunger in the city, and then there is unrest. We have a couple of these examples, but I don't see it directed against the kings, and it's not so permanent or so frequent. In fact, I see the recoveries of Babylonia in the later period, in the 130s, so under Demetrios and the second, and under Antiochus Tidetes. I only see that possible through a continued loyalty and a continued preference of the Seleucids compared to, say, their Parthian or Elymaian competitors. So that would be my response here, but I very willingly will go back into that narrative and try to understand it also, or read it against the grain, read it with a more conflictual perspective that you would apply. You're still.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to push so I won't push the issue. But this has been a long-standing discussion, and it'll take us too far afield from what you're doing here today. But I would just point out that this is something of a methodological challenge, right? You've mentioned how these foundation narratives erase the Antigonids, for example, right? That they are sometimes erased from these narratives. Local reception can similarly be erased if it is not congenial to the image that the dynasty wishes to promote, right? And so we have what is in effect one side, one half of a conversation, right? Which goes to the point that I made earlier about not having their interlocutors. These narratives are discursively formed, but we only have one half of the conversation. I would venture to guess that these relations are highly varied and change over time from one context to the next. This would be, I think, consistent for what we can see in cases that are better documented, where we do have both sides of a discussion or of a discourse. But in many of these cases, particularly in the ones presented by Malalas, we only have that one. We have an N of one, to use statistics parlance, right? And it's very difficult to kind of draw conclusions from that. So I'm just saying this idea of unity, can be of unifying elements can be more apparent than real when we only have one side of a discussion.
Obviously, that I fully concede, and my emphasis is on foundation legends, foundation narratives as being basically ideological expressions of how you as a people, or perhaps you as ruling that people, want ethnic identity to be seen, or and that is something very clear, that there are very strong ideological lenses, and that I think pertains likewise to the Babylonian case and to the examples of the Tetrapolis and whatnot. So that is important to see. And however, in some cases we can go a little further and compare these ideological perspectives, also with some evidence on the ground, examples of how people did behave in certain relations, say towards a ruler or say towards a different ethnic. And so in some instances, we may then have some correctives when it is about trying to identify or trying to recover the historical situation, which is not the same. And I try to always make that distinction when I do study ideology or legends, narrative. So I may not have been as explicit at on every single step, but normally I really want to be fully aware of this and share that awareness of the distinction between the ideological, often the virtual world, and the world on the ground. Okay, thank you very much again, Richard, and everyone in this meet. We are now, I'm now wrapping up, or just no more wrap up needed for this lecture, but rather two announcements. We won't have a lecture in May because the day would overlap with the annual meeting of the Classical Association of Canada in mid-May. But we'll have another Seleukid lecture on June the 18th, delivered by Ben Skolnick together with Graham Wrightson. And the title is Each Event on a Proper Scale, Polybius on Antiochus as the third campaign in Bactria. And I'd also like to well, remind you of the upcoming Seleukid Study Day 8 in Utrecht from the 12th to the 15th of November. Afterlife of the Seleukids, we have by now some 25 papers and are close to finalizing the program, which will also be soon released on the website. Okay, that is everything. I wish everyone then wonderful spring, happy Easter, happy Passover, and a great time until we see again. Thank you.
That went very well.